Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
In days gone by on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World.
12 days later, he hands me this masterpiece.
Oh, thank you, boss.
All right, tell him the title.
Chubby Rain.
What?
Chubby Rain. Tell him why.
You see, the aliens come down to Earth in the raindrops.
Yeah.
Making the raindrops chubby.
Aliens in the raindrops, Chubby Rain. I mean, at the end of this movie, when our hero, Keith Kincaid, looks up at the alien antenna and says, "Gotcha, suckers!" I mean, that is a moment.
You're listening to episode 374 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the Oakville Blobs. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to stick around for the end of the episode, as we'll have your feedback on our recent episode that included questions about round meat and square bread and other fascinating weird questions. But before that, in 1994, something really strange happened in the town of Oakville, Washington. It rained, which was not at all unusual, but the rain was mixed with tiny blobs, and nobody knew what the blobs were. Some of the local people and animals got sick after exposure to them. So what were the Oakville Blobs? Where did they come from? And has this mystery ever been solved? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So, Jimmy, what do we need to say to begin? We opened today's episode with a movie clip. Where was it from?
It was from the 1999 Steve Martin, Eddie Murphy movie, Bowfinger. When I started studying this mystery, I couldn't resist for reasons that will become apparent, and I've seen other YouTubers make the same connection. Bowfinger is a comedy about an incompetent but gung-ho filmmaker, kind of like a 1990s version of Ed Wood Jr. He was the creator of multiple bad movies, including the famous Plan 9 from Outer Space. And Bowfinger, which Steve Martin wrote, is inspired by figures like Ed Wood. Bowfinger is a really funny movie, and it contains a really funny parody of Scientology, though it is PG-13 and is not entirely family-friendly. Since today's episode deals with something that you could call Chubby Rain, and since people wonder if that might have been caused by aliens, because it's always aliens, I thought it would be appropriate to begin with a nod to that movie. And the fictional movie Chubby Rain itself seems to have been influenced by the 1978 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which the body snatcher aliens arrive on Earth in the form of translucent goo that falls from the sky in rain and coats plants on the ground and eventually turns into little pods that then start replacing humans as pod people.
Okay, let's talk about the real basis of today's mystery. Let's start by looking at where it happened. What should we know about Oakville, Washington?
Well, it's a small inland town in Washington state. The town's roots go back to the 1870s, and they decided to name it after the Gary oak trees that grow in the area. They got their post office in 1873, and the town officially incorporated in 1905. In the 1910 census, there were 465 people living there, but the population has gone up and down over time. Originally, since the town is surrounded by woods, lumber was a big part of the economy, but the lumber industry has apparently faded a bit, and by the 1950 census, the town only had 372 people. It's picked up since then. By the 1990s, when today's mystery occurred, the town had almost 500 people, and as of the 2020 census, it had 715. Yahoo!
Then let's turn to today's mystery. How did it begin?
On the night of Sunday, August 7th, 1994, at around 3 a.m., it began to rain. That's not considered surprising for Oakville. In fact, it has a reputation for it raining a lot there. Annually, Oakville gets 35 to 40 inches of rain, or about 3 inches a month. Though my own hometown of Fayetteville, Arkansas gets 47 inches a year, or 4 inches a month, so we get more water. But what's different about Oakville is how often they get it. There, it rains an average of 150 days a year, or about 40% of the year. while here in Fayetteville, it rains an average of 74 days a year, or only about 20% of the year. So Oakville gets very common but light rain, while Fayetteville gets less common but heavier rain. But there was something different about the rain in Oakville on this night. It was chubby rain. One of the first people to notice that the rain was different was likely police officer David Lacey. He and a civilian friend were in his patrol car on patrol when the rain started, and they did what you do when you're driving and it starts raining. So Officer Lacey turned on the windshield wipers. In a 2008 episode of Unsolved Mysteries, he explained what happened next.
We turned our windshield wipers on, and it just started smearing to the point where we could almost not see. And we both looked at each other and we said, geez, this isn't right. I mean, we're out in the middle of nowhere, basically, and where did this come from?
So instead of clearing the water off the windshield, when Officer Lacey turned on the windshield wipers, it just smeared the stuff around. They then decided to stop at a gas station to clean the windshield, and just to be extra careful, Officer Lacey put on a pair of latex gloves, which is something I approve of. Back during COVID, I started keeping a box of nitrile gloves in my truck, and I'd put on a pair whenever I stopped for gas. That's actually still something I do, since you never know who's sick, and I don't think they really clean the gas pump handles often. Certainly, we never cleaned them back when I worked at a gas station in the 1980s. In any event, when Officer Lacey cleaned his windshield, he made a new discovery.
The substance, it was very mushy. It's almost like if you had Jell-O in your hand, and you could pretty much squish it through your fingers. So we did have some bells go off in our heads that basically said that this isn't right, this isn't normal.
So Officer Lacey discovered that it wasn't ordinary water on his windscreen. Whatever had fallen out of the sky was mushy and had a texture like Jell-O. Later in the morning, when the sun came up, a local resident named Dottie Hearn made a similar discovery.
It looked like hail laying on top of the wood box and everywhere else. So I just went over and I touched it, and it wasn't hail. It was a gelatinous-like material.
So to Dottie, the substance initially looked like hail that had fallen in the night, but when she picked it up, it turned out to be gelatinous. Another person who described it was Dottie's daughter, Sunny Barclift. According to a story in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer,
"This stuff came out of the sky," Barclift said. "I want to know what it is." Twice in the past 2 weeks when it has rained, small blobs of clear, gelatinous goo have fallen on and around the home Barclift shares with her mother, Dottie Horn, on a 29-acre farm. The blobs, about half the size of rice grains, might have gone unnoticed had it not been for a number of circumstances, beginning with a small shed covered with black asphalt roofing. Barclift, who moved to Oakville last year from Phoenix after working for 6 years as Director of Occupational Safety and Health for the Arizona branch of the National Safety Council, noticed the clear, jelly-like particles on the shed roof after the rain stopped.
So according to Sunny, the goo was made out of particles about half the size of a grain of rice, which is pretty small for hail. Not long ago, I got an alert on my phone saying, take shelter because there's a severe thunderstorm warning with baseball-sized hail. I had heard a little hail on my roof, but fortunately nothing baseball-sized, and I also have a garage, so my truck was safe. But still, if you have hundreds of bits of small pieces of hail, it will be noticeable. And this wasn't hail. It was small bits of goo. It was later discovered that they had rained down on a 20 square mile area that, if it was a circle, would have had a radius of 2.5 miles and a diameter of 5 miles, or, for our metric friends, a radius of 4 kilometers and a diameter of 8 kilometers. So this was over quite a considerable area. We're also fortunate that Sunny Barclift started documenting the phenomenon right away, and she did some tests. As she explained to the Netflix series The Unexplained,
I thought it was very important to keep some sort of record, so I documented. At 4:30 p.m. of August 7th, 1994, my brother and I collect samples of the goo. My brother was a paramedic, and both of us are safety-oriented people, so we put gloves on before we handled it. Between 5 p.m. and 6:30 p.m., I conducted tests. It floats in water. Tried to dissolve it in alcohol. It does not break down. Flammability does not burn. Nothing like this had ever happened in my life before, and so I made phone calls. I was concerned because it fell on food. So I contacted the Department of Agriculture, and they really didn't seem to be concerned about it at all. I called the Department of Ecology. I called the U.S. Weather Service. No one was able to tell me what the substance was.
It's not surprising that none of the agencies could tell Sunny what the blobs were, but the tests she did are interesting. The blobs floated in water, they did not dissolve in alcohol, and they were not flammable. These could help eliminate some possibilities for what they might be, but the tests which she did in her home are too basic to allow it to narrow down too much.
Some listeners may be wondering what general category of phenomena something like this goes in. Haven't there been reports of other strange things raining out of the sky?
There have, and originally meteorites were in that category because originally they didn't know about stones being in outer space above the atmosphere, and stones are much heavier than air, so the idea of a stone falling from the sky seemed absurd. In fact, Thomas Jefferson is famously misquoted on this point. After some meteorites fell in Connecticut in 1807 and a couple of professors in the area published about it, Jefferson allegedly said
that it was easier to believe that two Yankee professors could lie than admit that stones could fall from heaven.
But Jefferson was actually much more nuanced in what he said, which was this.
We certainly are not to deny whatever we cannot account for. 1,000 phenomena present themselves daily, which we cannot explain. But where facts are suggested, bearing no analogy with the laws of nature as yet known to us, their veridity needs proofs proportion to their difficulty. A cautious mind will weigh well the opposition of the phenomenon to everything hitherto observed, the strength of the testimony by which it is supported, and the errors and misconceptions to which even our senses are liable. It may be very difficult to explain how the stone you possess came into the position in which it was found. But is it easier to explain how it got into the clouds from whence it is supposed to have fallen? The actual fact, however, is a thing to be established. And this, I hope, will be done by those whose situations and qualifications enable them to do it. I salute you with respect.
So Jefferson took a skeptical but open attitude towards meteorites. He thus was doing a kind of proto-Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World thing, and I salute him with respect. Today, however, we've solved the mystery of meteorites, but there are still lots of things that aren't expected to fall from the sky that nevertheless occasionally do. Some of these are animals. Back in the 1st century AD, the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder documented occasions when frogs and fish rained from the sky. You may remember our old friend Pliny the Elder from episodes 316 and 317 on unicorns, where we talked about Pliny's account of the unicorn and the very dramatic story of how he died in connection with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. It may have been a case of curiosity killing the cat, or the natural philosopher in Pliny's case. In addition to rains of frogs and rains of fish, there are also reports of rains of toads, rains of spiders, rains of rats, rains of big yellow mice, which may have been lemons, rains of worms, rains of jellyfish, rains of octopuses, rains of starfish, and rains of seashells. Because many of these rains involve animals, they're grouped together under the heading Rains of Animals, and we'll have a link so you can read about them. But not every unexpected rain involves animals. There are also reports of rains of wheat, rains of blood, rains of mud, and rains of chunks of meat, among others. I've seen these grouped together with rains of animals under the more general heading Skyfalls. And even though there's also a James Bond movie called Skyfall, I like that term since it's both general and descriptive. It will cover any weird thing falling out of the sky. We'll have a future episode on skyfalls, some of which have been solvable, like the meteorites were, but some of them are still mysterious.
Then let's get back to the situation in Oakville, Washington, and see if it can be solved. What happened after the strange bits of goo rained down?
Well, something very dramatic began to happen. You'll recall that Dottie Hearn had handled the goo with her bare hands. Later that same afternoon, she suddenly became ill.
I started feeling dizzy. Everything started moving around, and it got worse. And as it did, I became increasingly nauseated.
Her daughter Sunny found her collapsed on the bathroom floor and picks up the story.
She was cold, drenched with perspiration, pale. My mom had been vomiting. She had extreme vertigo. She complained that she had difficulty with her vision. Her vision was blurry.
Dottie had to be hospitalized for 4 days, and it wasn't just Dottie who got sick. You'll recall Officer Lacey. Well, even though he was wearing gloves when he handled the goo, he got sick that same afternoon also.
I was to the point where I could hardly breathe. I started to put together that possibly whatever the substance was, it made me violently sick, and ill, like I never had been before, to the point where, it just totally shut me down.
Other people were also being affected. Sunny Barclift and her brother had collected and touched the goo, and they both had minor bouts of nausea and fatigue, though not so much that they needed to be hospitalized. In 2015, Sunny told the website factslegend.org,
I became mildly nauseated a week or so after the first fallout. I became acutely ill with severe bronchitis 6 weeks post the initial fallout.
And the problem was broader than just them. In fact, people all over the place were getting sick. A man named Maurice said,
I got sick, my wife got sick, my daughter, everybody that lived here got sick.
And a woman named Beverly said,
everybody in the whole town came down with like a flu, only it was a really hard flu. It didn't last like 7 days, it lasted like 7 weeks to 2 or 3 months.
So this was an ongoing illness that didn't pass in a few days. In some cases, it lasted 2 or 3 months. And it wasn't just people who were getting sick. Animals were getting sick too, and some of them died. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer reports,
a newly adopted kitten, which lived outside, died days later after a struggle with severe intestinal problems.
According to what Sunny told factslegend.org,
my kitten died on or around the 3rd day of the blob fallout. It has been reported on some websites that the kitten had digestive problems prior to the fallout, but that is not true. Both of my mother's dogs fell ill 3 weeks after the first fallout. Nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. The vet said they had an infection, and they were treated with antibiotics. There were rumors that some nearby farms experienced death of larger animals, such as horses and cows. I did not investigate those allegations. I have no reason to dispute them, but they are hearsay. It is interesting to note that my mother had a plethora of outdoor cats used as mousers in the barns and such. Gradually, over the following months, some of those cats also died or went missing. In time, the remaining cats were able to build up a healthy population again.
It sounds like the town was having a really frightening experience after the blobs fell. They still had to deal with the resulting illnesses. But was the fall of the blobs over at this point?
Actually, no. There was another rain of blobs on Tuesday, August 16th, or 10 days after the initial blob fall. And in the 10 days after that, the blobs fell 4 more times. All told, there were 6 blob falls in a period of 3 weeks. So this wasn't a single incident, but something that kept happening in the community for almost a month.
Did the authorities have any explanation for what the blobs were?
No. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer reported,
we don't know what it is or where it came from, said Dick Meyer, spokesman for the Federal Aviation Administration in Seattle. It's a puzzle.
But there were theories that were being floated about what the blobs were, and there were some clues that were starting to emerge. So now we're going to look at the theories and the evidence that would support or refute them.
But before we do that, we'd like to take a moment now to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Danielle H., Morgan N., Jacob K., Richard L., and Alexandra S. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. More than 90% of our financial support comes from individual donors like you, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. So, Jimmy, what theories should we cover about the Oakville Blobs?
There are two fundamental issues. First, was there a connection between the illnesses and the blobs? And second, where did the blobs come from? In regard to the first issue, it's been proposed that the blobs caused the illnesses that were being reported, and it's been proposed that they were just coincidental and had nothing to do with the blobs. With regard to where the blobs came from, it's been proposed that they didn't actually fall from the sky, that people just came out and found them lying on things after a rainstorm and assumed they'd fallen from the sky. The alternative, of course, is that they did fall from the sky. If they fell from the sky, several theories have been proposed. One is that they were human waste that fell out of an aircraft. Another is that they were a substance known as star jelly. Another is that they were essentially parts of jellyfish. Another is that they were a substance known as Waterlock. And another is that they were part of a military experiment.
Then let's go through each of the theories one by one. What can we say about the Oakville Blobs from the reason perspective? Let's start with the issue of whether the illnesses were connected with the blobs, and let's look at both sides of the issue. How would you argue that they weren't connected?
Well, the first thing that could be pointed out is that a good bit of the evidence is anecdotal. According to what Sonny told factslegend.org in 2015,
it is my understanding that after the fallout, several people in the community did come down with a flu-like illness that lasted for 4 to 8 weeks in some cases. A couple that stick out in my mind were two individuals who had complications associated with kidney infection, or kidney involvement, which I think is somewhat unusual. I did not go door to door and interview people as to the state of their health. Mostly, the information gleaned was during casual conversations and overhearing statements made by others. I have no idea about what each person's personal diagnosis was. Communally, it was thought to be something like the flu.
So, as Sonny notes, the information gatherings on this seem to be pretty informal, just conversations and stuff. It's not like the Centers for Disease Control or the National Institutes for Health swooped in and did a community survey. Also, as we previously heard, Sonny said that she'd heard rumors that certain local farms had larger animals like horses and cows die, but she didn't follow up on these rumors, so they may not be true. Given that, it could be argued that the whole idea that the blobs caused illnesses is just a rumor, that a few people and animals coincidentally happened to get sick at the time of the unusual rain, and the two events were unrelated, but then rumors started that they were connected, and it all got blown out of proportion.
Are there any other arguments you can think of that would support this idea?
One would be if people or animals who got sick had pre-existing conditions. In that case, the illnesses they experienced might have been due to the pre-existing conditions and not the blobs. Earlier, we heard Sonny say that some websites had reported that the kitten that died had had digestive issues before the blob fall, but she said this wasn't true. On the other hand, we also heard Sonny say that 2 of the individuals who got sick had kidney problems. I'm not sure if she was saying they got kidney problems after the blob fall or that they had kidney problems before the blob fall. But if it was the latter, their pre-existing kidney problems could have resulted in them getting sick due to something unrelated to the blobs.
Okay, if those are the arguments against the illnesses being connected to the blobs, what's the argument for them being connected?
Well, first, there's the prima facie connection that was perceived by the people in Oakville. The fact that they perceived a connection gives us initial, if inconclusive, evidence that one existed. Then there's the apparent spread of the illness. As we heard earlier, it was quite widespread. In fact, according to newspaper accounts, the local police chief, Jerry Grube, talked to about 30 people who got sick at this time. And there may have been considerably more than that. It's just that the chief talked to 30 of them. And this is a significant number in a town that only had around 500 people in it. We also heard from a man named Maurice who said everybody who lived here got sick, and from a woman named Beverly who said everybody in the whole town came down with like a flu. I'm sure both of those statements are hyperbolic and it wasn't literally everyone in town, but it does indicate that this was a widespread illness after the blob fall, and you can't just explain something that widespread by appealing to pre-existing conditions. You could explain it by saying the town had an outbreak of a highly infectious form of the flu, and so it was a coincidence. But then why was only Oakville affected by this flu? Why didn't it hit other communities? In fact, if it was highly infectious, why didn't it infect the whole nation, or at least enough to get noticed? Because the U.S. healthcare authorities do monitor what's going on with the flu every year. That's part of how they formulate the flu vaccine. I thus think that this provides more prima facie evidence for a connection of the illness with the blobs. A third argument for a connection is that there also seems to be a plausible rationale for who got hit with the illnesses and how bad. For example, those who had early exposure and also had physical contact with the blobs got hit worse. Thus, Officer Lacey didn't have physical contacts with the blobs, but he was exposed to them immediately upon their fallen, when they might have been at their most infectious. He also may have been hit with some when he got out to clean the car. Dottie Hearn was exposed later on after sunrise that first day, so not quite as early as Officer Lacey, but she had physical contact and landed in the hospital for 4 days. Meanwhile, her daughter Sunny and Sunny's brother were exposed a bit later than Dottie. They both wore gloves, and Sunny reported,
Once my mother had pointed out the substance to myself and my brother, we decided to wear gloves because it was an unknown substance. My background is in occupational safety and health, so I opted to wear gloves as a precaution.
And Sunny and her brother only had mild nausea and exhaustion that didn't require hospitalization. Some of the animals were hit really hard and some died, which could be because they may have eaten or licked some of the blobs. And there are anecdotal reports of smaller animals being hit harder than larger ones, which is what you would expect if the blobs were responsible, since smaller animal bodies would be less well able to handle toxins that came into contact with them. The fourth argument, which I think is the most powerful, is the sudden or acute onset of illness in multiple people immediately after the blob fall. In medicine, something that happens suddenly and requires medical attention is called acute. And that's what happened to more than one person. As Sunny told factslegend.org,
Some individuals, such as my mother, Dottie Horn, and David Lacey, the police officer, had more acute symptoms. When my mother first found the substance, on top of a box on the porch where she stored her wood for burning, she touched the substance with her bare hands. Although David Lacey said he wore gloves, he too became very ill within hours of contact with the substance.
And I think having more than one person have an illness that required hospitalization within hours of contact with the blobs is quite significant evidence.
Then what do you make of the overall situation? Do you think the arguments for or against a connection between the illnesses and the blobs are stronger?
I think the arguments for a connection are stronger. I'm not convinced of a connection given the data I have, but I think the arguments in favor of a connection are stronger. I'd like to have more data to settle this question, but since the event occurred 31 years ago, we have very limited data on it. Some of the claims are inaccurate, like the kitten having digestive problems, and apparently there wasn't a lot of organized data collection about the illnesses. I'm afraid that the case can only be tentative, but I tentatively conclude that the blobs caused the illnesses. I'd reverse this conclusion and say that there was no connection if we're able to figure out what the blobs were, and if there was no way that that would plausibly cause the illnesses. But my working assumption is that there is a connection.
Then let's turn to the theories about the blobs themselves. What about the idea that they didn't really fall from the sky, that they originated on the ground, but people only noticed them after a rainfall and so concluded they fell from the sky?
I think this is a good question to ask because we should think through all possibilities. But I don't think this proposal holds up. The blobs didn't just appear once after a rainfall. They appeared 6 times after rainfalls, and that indicates a connection between them and something falling from the sky. You could propose that ordinary water rain triggered their formation, like maybe there were spores or something that grew overnight and became visible when they were exposed to water, kind of like mushrooms. But if the Oakville area was infested with such spores, why did they only bloom on these 6 occasions? Why don't they do so over and over as part of their life cycle? And why aren't they known to science so that they would be immediately identifiable by local biologists? However, the most compelling argument is that we have an eyewitness to the blobs falling from the sky. Two, in fact. You'll recall that Officer Lacey was driving with his friend when they started to fall. They saw them fall. Officer Lacey's windshield wipers just smushed them around, and so they had to stop at a gas station to clean the windshield by hand, and Officer Lacey felt them and said they had a texture like Jell-O. So I think that this conclusively shows that the blobs did fall from the sky.
Then let's turn to the theories that might explain them. You said one of the theories was that they may have been human waste that came from an airplane. What is the argument in favor of this proposal?
To understand this, we need to fill in another piece of the story. You'll recall that Sunny had been the director of occupational safety and health for a safety organization when she lived in Arizona. Well, as they were getting ready for her mom to go to the hospital, suddenly Sunny realized that the blobs might be responsible for her mother's condition, so she took a sample for the doctor. She stated,
Dr. Little was the attending physician on duty when my mother arrived by ambulance at McCleary Hospital. I had brought a sample of the substance to the hospital and explained to Dr. Little that less than 24 hours earlier, she had made contact with the substance, and since we didn't know what it was, would he be willing to do a lab test on it? He agreed and had a lab technician do a routine lab exam. That is when the white blood cell was found. Dr. Little was intrigued by it, but baffled as we were. My best recollection is that the lab tech who conducted the test on the goo was known as Kelly.
So, okay, they found what appeared to be a human white blood cell in the goo, and that led to the thought that it might contain human biological material, but, well, how could human biological material fall from the sky? Well, someone thought that it might be waste that had fallen from an airplane, so this was one of the first ideas proposed.
What do you make of this proposal?
For several reasons, it won't work. First, as we'll hear, there were other analyses of the blobs that didn't find human white blood cells, so that finding may have been mistaken. It may have just been random contamination or something. Second, this would have been more explainable at the time, given that the blobs had only fallen once so far, but the waste example wouldn't work as an explanation after they'd fallen 6 times in a row on the same community. Third, airplanes do not normally leak human waste. There's a myth that planes jettison the contents of their septic tanks while in flight, but this does not happen. In fact, their septic tanks are not built to jettison their contents in flight. They can leak, and when they do, they release what is known in aviation as blue ice. It's called ice because planes fly high enough that the waste freezes, and it's called blue because the septic tanks have blue dye in them. Among other things, this makes it easier, the blue dye, makes it easier for people on the ground to find the leaked material once it's landed since it's dyed bright blue. Well, fourth, the Oakville Blobs were not blue. Sunny reports,
It is important to note that the gel-like substance, which was clear, no color at all, and about the size of rice grains, was literally everywhere. In the grass, on foliage, on my truck window.
So no blue dye, and thus it was not melted blue ice.
Then what about another proposal that was made? Could the blobs have been what's known as star jelly?
Okay, so star jelly is a jelly-like substance that's found on the ground, and it's noticed sometimes after meteorite falls, leading to the name star jelly, since people connected it with the meteorite, even though today it's believed not to have any connection with space. Today, the term star jelly is a kind of catch-all term that refers to any kind of goo that you find and don't know the explanation for. So if you want, you could call the Oakville Blob star jelly, but that wouldn't explain anything since there are many different explanations for star jelly. Wikipedia notes,
Star jelly, also called astromyxin, astral jelly, is a gelatinous substance sometimes found on grass and less commonly on the branches of trees. According to folklore, it is deposited on the earth during meteor showers. It is described as a translucent or grayish-white gelatin that tends to evaporate shortly after having fallen. Explanations have ranged from it being the remains of frogs, toads, or worms, to the byproducts of cyanobacteria, to being the fruiting bodies of jelly fungi or masses of amoeba called slime molds. Non-biological origins proposed for instances of star jelly have included byproducts from industrial production or waste management. Reports of the substance date back to the 14th century and have continued to the present.
So star jelly isn't just one thing. It's thought to be a bunch of things. Also, it's usually found on the ground. But in the case of the Oakville Blobs, we have eyewitnesses who saw them falling from the sky when Officer Lacey and his companion had to stop to clean them off the windshield. In any event, this proposal might give the Oakville Blobs a label, but it wouldn't provide an explanation.
Then let's turn to the next proposal. Could the blobs have been somehow connected with jellyfish? And why would anybody think that?
Well, the blobs were gooey and jellyfish are gooey, so especially if you cut them up. So Sonny explains how the idea developed.
Someone theorized that since the Navy had been conducting live bombing runs at sea, they might have blown up a school of jellyfish. And of course, this jellyfish would have been thrown up into the air and floated 50 miles inland, and over a period of 3 weeks, fallen 6 times. I find that somewhat preposterous.
Similarly, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer reported,
FAA spokesman Dick Meyer said the FAA investigator asked the military if there had been any flights over the area or any exercises that might explain the blobs. This is where the jellyfish theory came in, Meyer said. It's not clear who should get credit for proposing this theory, but it's based on the fact that the blobs appeared around the time the Air Force was dropping bombs in the Pacific Ocean off the Washington coast. They were conducting bombing runs using live ordnance, said Master Sergeant Thaddeus Hoseley, spokesman at McChord Air Force Base. Hoseley said the 354th Fighter Squadron was flying last week and this week, dropping bombs about 10 to 20 miles west of ocean shores. Despite the 40 to 50 miles separating the bombing runs and the blob fallout, Oakville Chief of Police Gary Greb said somebody suggested a school of jellyfish might have been blown literally sky high. McCord's Hoseley, trying to stifle a laugh, said he could not comment on the jellyfish theory. That's ridiculous, said Sonny Barclift. Besides, she said, this wouldn't explain why the blobs came twice at this time, or why they come only when it rains.
The problem with the jellyfish theory is that it's quite implausible. Even if the Air Force had blown up a school of jellyfish in its practice bombing runs, which is itself entirely speculative, it's implausible that they would have been so thoroughly pulverized that they would stay up in the air. It's implausible that they would have gone up the thousands of feet needed to get mixed up with rain clouds. It's implausible that they would have drifted the 50 miles to get to Oakville. It's implausible that they would have stayed up for 3 weeks. It's implausible that they would have stayed over Oakville for 3 weeks and not drifted elsewhere. It's implausible that it was just jellyfish with no other creatures whose parts would have been visible in the mix, like maybe a crab claw or something. Or fish. And it's implausible that upon raining down, they wouldn't have started to stink. So this is a multiply implausible theory. That didn't stop it from being popular, though. The New York Times reported,
some people want to start an annual jellyfish festival now where they shoot jellyfish into town with a cannon, Sonny said, laughing. Barcliff noted that the town's tavern is also concocting a new drink, the Jellyfish, made of vodka, gelatin, and juice.
Okay, then let's set aside the jellyfish theory and turn to the next one. What is Waterlock, and why did some people think it might be that?
Waterlock is a substance that's also known as sodium polyacrylate. It's a polymer that can absorb hundreds of times its own weight in water and hold it in. Hence, it's called Waterlock. It's used for a bunch of things, including as filler for diapers and absorbency garments. It's also used by florists and as ammo for toy guns and in gardening to improve the soil. Some have thought that it might be connected with the Oakville Blobs because it looks similar. It can be translucent. I mean, they can also dye it colors, but it can be translucent, and it sometimes comes in grains that someone might identify as smaller than a grain of rice. There's also a similar event that some have pointed to. In 2012, or 18 years after the Oakville Blobs, a man in Dorset, England, experienced something similar. There was a hailstorm in his area, and afterward he came out and found these strange blue gelatinous balls on his lawn. They were later confirmed to have been made of Waterlock, and it's not clear how they got into his garden, but one proposal is that they were already on the ground. Someone pitched them over a fence in their tiny dry form, and so they went unnoticed. And then, since Waterlock can hold hundreds of times its own weight in water, they expanded when the rain came and the hail melted.
It was a local university that determined the Dorset man had found Waterlock. What did the testing done on the Oakville Blobs reveal?
Well, there were several tests done. One of the experts who examined them was Tim Davis, a microbiologist at the private firm Amtest Laboratories. He said,
I saw what I think was a eukaryotic cell, which is basically a cell that has a definable nucleus and is found present in most animals.
Sonny Barcliffe continues the story.
I was contacting as many agencies as possible to find assistance in identifying the substance. I took a sample to Mike Osweiler. Mike Osweiler worked for the Department of Ecology. The department concluded it was an organic material. They determined they did find a cell with a nucleus, which indicated to them that it was biological. The cell could have been a bacteria. It was never specified.
So here we have indications that the blobs contain biological matter, but there's more to the story. Another of the experts who examined a sample of the blobs was Mike McDowell of Washington State Department of Health.
It was very uniform. There was no structure that we could see visibly or with a microscope. I set it up on various microbiological media and attempted to isolate bacteria.
Sonny Barcliffe continues the story.
I was concerned about the material and spoke with Dr. Kobayashi at the Washington State Health Laboratory. He advised me to send a sample of the material. I mailed a sample to the Washington State Health Lab, which was assigned to Mike McDowell, one of their epidemiologists on staff. Mike initially set the gel up on bacterial media to see if it would grow anything. It grew two types of bacteria, Pseudomonas fluorescens and Enterobacter cloacae.
In other discussions of the Oakville Blobs, I've seen people dismiss these as either harmless or mostly harmless bacteria, but they're not entirely safe. Pseudomonas fluorescens can cause pneumonia in some patients, particularly those with compromised immune systems. And Enterobacter cloacae also isn't normally harmful to humans, but it can contribute to infections, particularly for those who are immunocompromised. However, notice that McDowell said that he didn't see any structure in the substance, even under a microscope. That makes it sound like the substance was not made of cells. It could have been a natural substance, or it could have been an artificial one, including but not limited to being made of Waterlock. It could have been something else. Sonny Barcliffe continues.
The gel specimen was locked in a medium containment facility, and over time, Mike McDowell continued to research it. At some point, he drew the conclusion that the material itself was man-made and was being used as a matrix, a vehicle capable of transporting a virus or bacteria. He did report his findings to his supervisor. When he returned to the lab at some point, he discovered the substance was missing. Again, he reported this to his supervisor and was advised at that point to not ask any questions. Mike is retired now and still does occasional interviews regarding the subject. I trust his judgment and his findings, as he was a credible expert in the field. Mike was interviewed 4 or 5 years ago on a program on the National Geographic Channel. The information about the substance missing was revealed in the program. I suspect he was reluctant to speak of it while still employed. He stated that it was the first time in 30 years of service with his job that a sample he was responsible for had gone missing.
Okay, so McDowell concluded that the material was man-made and that it was being used as a vehicle to transport microbes, which could explain the illnesses people in Oakville had after exposure to it. However, despite the fact that he had the sample locked in a medium biohazard containment unit, it vanished. Now, that could have been due to a number of things. I don't know if anyone else had access to that containment unit, but if someone did, they may have moved it or thrown it away, so this could be innocent. But Sonny reports that McDowell was told not to ask any questions. That also could be innocent. For example, if the lab had a cranky boss or there were office politics, someone could have said, don't ask questions, don't make a big deal of this or it'll cause trouble here in the office. However, I found another account of the event. McDowell's sons told the Unexplained.
I just asked my dad, I was like, hey, remember that story you did on Unsolved Mysteries? You never told us the answer to that. Like, what did you find in those blobs? And he told me, he goes, I never got to finish, and that really frustrated me. Before I could finish what I was doing, someone came and grabbed it. My dad did say suits came in, and I was like, suits? And he was like, yeah, he didn't know if it was government, but he said black suits. That's what the lady at the front desk told him, the black suits came and took it.
So if this account is accurate, it would be very significant. Men in suits showed up and took the samples that McDowell had stored under lock and key. I assume that they showed the receptionist and perhaps other people at the lab some kind of identification and authorization to do this. However, the information about who they were didn't get passed on to McDowell because he didn't know if the men in suits had been government or not. That puts the don't ask questions comment in a new light and makes it sound much more sinister.
This brings us to our final theory about the blobs, that they were part of a government experiment that was being run on Oakville. What do you make of this explanation?
Well, it's the one that Sonny Barcliffe ended up adopting, as she told the Unexplained.
I found that Mike McDowell called it a matrix. He said it was a substance that was like an envelope that something could be inserted into, like a germ or a virus.
He thought it was a delivery system, like a carrier system. He did say that. He goes, I don't have any proof, but it does look like it was for like carrying something.
Based on what I know now that I didn't know then, I think it was a military exercise. I really do. It's happened throughout history where they have done types of experiments on people without their permission.
She also noted that there had been some unusual aircraft activity recently. In this clip, in addition to Sonny speaking, we also hear part of a videotape made by her mother, Dottie.
For several months before the fallout of the blobs, fairly frequently, at least once or twice a week, we would have flyovers of big black helicopters.
There's a black helicopter flying over. I want to get him on tape. They say there's no such thing, but there is.
Reports of unmarked black helicopters were very common back in the 1990s. They were widely believed to belong to the government, or at least the military, and there were many conspiracy proposals made about them, a conspiracy being an agreement between two or more people to do something illegal. So the idea was that the government was up to something illegal, which is par for the course for the government. Now, I don't know that these helicopters had anything to do with the blobs. In the first place, I don't know that they were really black and unmarked. It's hard to tell what color and markings a helicopter has if you're seeing it below against the bright sky. It may look black just because it's in silhouette. And even if it is black and unmarked, that doesn't mean it had anything to do with the blobs, because Sonny said that the helicopters were seen for several months before the blobs, but she doesn't say that they were seen at the time of the blob falls themselves, so this may be unrelated.
If the blobs were part of a government experiment, what might their purpose have been?
Well, if the blobs made people sick, it would presumably be some kind of biological warfare experiment. The blobs were reportedly made from an artificial matrix that you could load some kind of mild pathogen in, something that would make people sick but not kill them, and then you could release it as a test to see what it would do if dropped on a community. Sonny herself made a suggestion about the purpose of the experiment, telling factslegend.org.
Over the years, I have held some information close to me. Very little about it has been released to the press. However, 2 years ago, some information surfaced on the internet that led me to the conclusion that the Oakville event was in fact a continuity exercise conducted by the military.
In normal military parlance, a continuity exercise, also known as a continuity of operations exercise, is designed to test how a military unit functions during a crisis. In other words, can it continue its operations when things are going wrong? However, that doesn't seem to fit what happened in Oakville, as a military unit didn't sweep into town and do military operations during the period of illness. There are also continuity of government plans that the government has in case of a disaster, and the military might support these. But at present, I don't see how these would apply to the Oakville situation. Perhaps Sonny will say more about this in the future, but for now, it looks like to me, if this was a military experiment, that it was a straightforward biological warfare one, either to gather information about a bioweapons delivery system or to gather information about how a bioweapon might affect a community, or both.
How plausible do you find the idea that this was a military experiment?
Well, it's certainly not implausible in principle. In fact, the U.S. government has a history of doing such experiments on people without their consent. For example, in September of 1950, the U.S. Navy conducted an experiment called Operation Sea Spray. They had a ship off the coast of San Francisco, and without telling the authorities there, they sprayed the city with a couple of strains of bacteria that were believed to be harmless. However, they may not have been, because there were reports of unusual illnesses and one death, though these have not been conclusively linked to the spraying. And this test was far from alone. I've seen reports of 200 such tests being done, and we'll have a link to where you can read more about unethical human experiments in the United States.
What would the argument against the Oakville Blobs being a military test exercise be?
Well, first, a lot of the testing was done decades ago in the mid-20th century, much of it being the product of the Cold War. You could say that this represents the experiments that were later discovered, and we simply haven't found the more recent ones because it takes a while for that to happen. But when these experiments were discovered, they caused a huge ruckus. In the 1970s, congressional hearings were held, new policies were implemented. President Richard Nixon announced the closure of the U.S. biological weapons program, and international treaties were signed that would prevent this type of testing. So all of those are reasons why the U.S. government shouldn't have done such a test.
And what would the case for it being such a biological test be?
Well, even though the U.S. says it doesn't currently have an active bioweapons program, it does have a biodefense program, and people involved with that could justify testing for learning things for defensive purposes. The testing also could have been authorized by people who were acting without authority. In other words, rogue individuals who decided to do the testing on their own, either completely on their own or to give their bosses plausible deniability in case it got discovered. And there could always be a covert bioweapons program that isn't purely defensive and that we haven't been told about, and that the civilian leadership the government has may not even know about. Also, the Oakville Blobs fell in 1994, and there was a history of the government doing some really horrendous things to civilians in this period, like the Ruby Ridge standoff in 1992, where Randy Weaver's family was besieged by the FBI, and Weaver's wife, son, and friend were shot and killed. We talked about the Ruby Ridge incident in episode 114, if you'd like to hear about it. There was also the 1993 Branch Davidian standoff in Waco, Texas, where the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms led a raid on the Branch Davidians, and then the FBI conducted a siege at their headquarters, and there are serious indications pointing to the government starting the fire that took the lives of all of the people inside. We talked about that in episodes 96 and 97, if you'd like to learn more. Now, these incidents were overseen by the Justice Department, not the military, but they got a ton of publicity, and with those kind of shenanigans happening in the news, it's entirely possible that they inspired other people to decide non-fatal experiments on the citizens of a remote Washington community might be okay, or there may have been a policy somewhere that said they were okay. After events like these, it looked like the government learned its lesson, at least for a while, and future confrontations were handled much better. But there was a sense that in the early 1990s, the government was being really careless with the lives of American citizens.
So what do you make of the overall possibilities here? Were the Oakville Blobs part of a government or military experiment?
Well, they should not have been, given the stated policies and international treaties of the time, but just because something shouldn't happen doesn't mean it didn't happen. And the evidence we have seems to point towards the Oakville Blobs being a biowarfare test of some kind. I can't say that conclusively. I wish we had more evidence, like the samples of the blobs that were mysteriously removed from McDowell's lab, but it does seem to me that the balance of probability points towards this being such an experiment.
And what can we say about the Oakville Blobs from the faith perspective?
Well, it depends on what they were. If they were just some unusual natural phenomenon that humans were not involved in, then they don't really have any significance. They're just something weird that happened. On the other hand, if they were part of a biological warfare experiment, then they were unethical. It is immoral to do experiments on people without their consent, and they should not have been conducted. If you need to see what would happen to a community in a situation like this, you should not use a real community. You should build a model community, populate it with volunteers who have given informed consent, like perhaps members of the military, and then you do your absolute utmost to make sure nobody is seriously hurt. But under no circumstances should you do experiments like this on ordinary people without their consent.
And Jimmy, what's your bottom line here?
The Oakville Blobs are a really strange incident. They definitely fell from the sky, and they appear to be linked to a wave of illnesses in Oakville. Many of the proposed explanations for them are very implausible. For example, they don't appear to be human waste from an aircraft, and they don't appear to be parts of jellyfish. Instead, the evidence seems to point towards them being some kind of biological warfare experiment, even though running one in this situation would have been both immoral and illegal.
And Jimmy, what further resources can we offer?
We'll have links to Steve Martin's movie Bowfinger, Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space, the Netflix episode of The Unexplained that deals with the blobs, also the 2009 Unsolved Mysteries episode, information about Oakville, Washington, what Thomas Jefferson really said about meteorites, information on rains of animals, skyfalls, blue ice, star jelly, Waterlock, also information about the Dorset blue balls mystery, Pseudomonas fluorescens and Enterobacter cloacae, Operation Sea Spray, and unethical human experiments in the United States.
And now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. And this feedback is coming on our recent episode, 367, Round Meat, Square Bread, and More Weird Questions. And so, Jimmy, our first feedback comes from Ryan Nagy via email. And Ryan says, I'm a big fan of Mysterious World and thrilled to see that you hit 100,000 YouTube subscribers. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And I thought I would show the viewing audience, for those who are watching the video version of the podcast, the YouTube play button that they sent me. It finally came in the mail. And it says, presented to Jimmy Akin for passing 100,000 subscribers. And like many YouTubers who've been able to do that, you will be seeing you'll be seeing it in the background in future videos. Some folks asked if I plan on doing a 100,000 subscriber special, and I actually hadn't thought of that prior to it, partly because I didn't know when it was going to be happening, and it happened very suddenly. Basically, when Pope Leo was elected, I did an initial here are my first thoughts about Leo video on the same day that he was elected, and it for me went viral, and wham, the next day I had gained like 2,000 subscribers, and so that put us over the top. And it happened unexpectedly. I thought it might take another month or two to get there. So I apologize for not having a special lined up, but I'll see what we can do in the future. And thanks to everybody for your support and subscription to the channel.
Excellent. And so Ryan continues, in your recent Weird Questions episode with Cy Kellett, you discussed humans and angels falling from grace. And this prompted a few follow-up questions. One, since demons and incarnate human souls exist in time, is it possible for a damned spirit or soul to change its orientation toward God and be redeemed? If not, why not?
The church has not said anything definitive in this area, but the standard view is that for both angels who have fallen and for humans who die in outside of a state of grace, they are not capable of changing their orientation. That the principle is that both humans and angels are given a time of probation during which they must choose for or against God or, love, because God is love. And if they, at the end of their probation, which for humans, it coincides with the end of our earthly lives, our will becomes fixed. at that point. So humans don't change their orientation after they die, and demons, even though they didn't have earthly lives, they don't change either after their probationary period. Now, why that is, it could be answered in a couple of ways. One is, well, God, that's how God set it up. Another way of looking at it would be to ask, well, why did God set it up that way? And here we're on much more speculative territory. We could speculate that, well, God wants us to make a definitive choice at some point. And so there has to be a limit to when that choice gets made. And in the case of humans, it just happens to be at the end of our lives. But like I said, the church hadn't said anything definitive here, and what it has said is pretty tentative.
And that may include his last question, which was, why would such mercy, such as the sacrament of confession, be available only to the living?
Yeah, well, fundamentally for the same reason. There's also a biblical passage motivating this. In Hebrews, it says, it is appointed for man once to die, and then comes judgment. And so that has been understood to mean there's no chance of repentance after death, that if you die unrepentant, you stay unrepentant.
All right. And then he finishes up, I'd appreciate your insight on these questions, and thank you and Dom for all your hard work. And then our next feedback comes from Jack Skeen on YouTube, who says, hey, Jimmy, at 20 minutes and 58 seconds, you mentioned that we, quote, have records from the 2nd century of people in Palestine who had things that Jesus and Joseph had made, end quote. I've never heard of these records before, but that's super interesting. Could you please explain which records these are and where you found them? Thanks.
Well, they're in the writings of Christians in the 2nd century, or at least Christians who were quoting sources in the 2nd century. I did a little bit of looking, and I couldn't find the ones I was remembering, because I was remembering people talking about how they still had like yokes and things that Jesus had made, and I didn't find that. I mean, it's possible that could be a bad memory, but I didn't have a super long time to look. What I did find was a reference to the kinds of things that Jesus made from the 2nd century author Justin Martyr, who died in the mid-2nd century, so around 150, 160 AD. And in one of his works, known as the Dialogue with Trypho, he's talking about Jesus, and Justin says, and he, Jesus, was deemed a carpenter, for he was in the habit of working as a carpenter when among men, making plows and yokes, by which he taught the symbols of righteousness and an active life. So that would be one of the things I would cite, but my memory is there may be others as well.
That certainly makes Jesus' mention of plows and yokes in the Gospels all that more interesting. He probably was intimately aware of all that went into those, so that's really nice. And then finally, Slans1 on YouTube writes, I was hoping for, is a hot dog a sandwich instead of a question of round meat and square bread?
Well, that was the question I was asked. So I try to answer questions as they come in, and if people are interested in related questions, they're welcome to do that. And so since Slans1 has now asked, is a hot dog a sandwich? I would say it depends on how one defines a sandwich. It does involve meat that is contained, or other filling, it could be a veggie dog, that's contained within bread. And thus, by that standard, it could be considered a sandwich. On the other hand, sandwiches have a prototypical form that differs markedly in shape or morphology from a hot dog. A hot dog does not look like, in its shape, what is normally thought of as a sandwich, kind of like a penguin or an ostrich does not look like a prototypical bird being something more like a robin or a swallow. And so I would say that this is one of those cases where it's going to depend on on what criteria you're using for definition. If you are fairly loose in your sandwich morphology, then you could consider an open face sandwich that has only one slice of bread a sandwich, and you thus might extend to that to a hot dog, because a hot dog bun is basically one piece of bread, but it's been folded in such a way that you get the fill-in between two layers of bread. And so you could argue it that way. You also, though, might get to the point where you're arguing that a pizza is an open-face sandwich, because you've got a bread base with toppings on top of it, and that's basically an open-face sandwich. And you could take a pizza and fold it in half, like some they don't call them pizzas in the Middle East, but they have these. They have these. They functionally are pizzas, where they put a kind of spread on top of a pita or flatbread, and then they may fold it in half, and you could call that a sandwich too. So we get into some interesting areas where it becomes all about semantics.
While there have been no court cases defining the hot dog as a sandwich, there have been some legal definition rulings in some states, because there are taxation rules about whether you can tax a sandwich and not, and that sort of stuff that have come up. So there are some states where it is a sandwich and some states where it is not. And so it just sort of depends on where you live. Although in Massachusetts, court has decreed that a burrito is not a sandwich. So there you go. We barely have burritos in the state anyway. But thank you, Slants1, for the interesting question. And thank you, everyone, for your feedback. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about the Oakville Blobs and the various theories about them? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. Check it out by going to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, do all the YouTube things. Like, comment, share the podcast with others, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video. We recently passed 100,000 subscribers. Yay. Thank you so much. Now we're heading to 200,000, and we'd love for you to join us.
I also want to thank Anna Fontaine for her voiceover work on this episode. So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be looking at one of the most famous cryptids or hidden animals of all. Specifically, we're going to be looking at what can be determined about Bigfoot based on the reports of him. So join us as we examine the biology of Bigfoot.
Excellent. Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends. Write a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get the ability to write reviews or give ratings. We really do appreciate that, but it also helps us grow our community and reach more listeners. Be sure to get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/374. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. That's very important, folks. We really do need your help. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.